If it's the 15th of the month, that means it's time to take a dive into my weird record collection.
As girls, we started in Sears school to learn the charmer's golden rule. We came to study the finer things that only knowledge of charm can bring. As graduates, we'll now proceed, confident that we'll succeed. Radiance within our smile, we'll step out with poise and style, and with the knowledge we have gained, and the glamour we've attained, we will meet the world anew, young ladies in review.
Welcome, my friends, to episode 9 of my weird record collection. I'm Sean, and I'm coming to you from Chicago, inviting you into my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. In this episode, we're going to look at a couple of records that were given to the world by Sears, Roebuck & Company. But first, I wanted to take care of some business. First of all, got some feedback from a listener named Jim, who's from, let me see, where is he from? Oh, he's right here in Chicago. And he had a couple of comments to make about episode 7, in which we talked about the record Everything You Need to Know to Operate a CB Radio, featuring the voice of, what the heck was that guy's name? Peter Thomas, I believe. Yeah. So Jim says, having been 9 years old in 1976, this episode resonated with me. My friend's parents had a CB in the car, complete with the rear bumper mounted long antenna bent forward with the tip somehow attached to the roof of the car. Pretty badass stuff. A few more thoughts. If you've ever taken CPR training that involved a Philips AED, that is an automated external defibrillator, the device is voiced by Peter Thomas, as it were. Oh, wow. That's really something. Yeah, I've never taken CPR training, and I really probably should. I'd like to sometime. And, I'll have to keep an ear out for that if they do use that Philips device, which I believe is very likely, given that Philips is pretty ubiquitous in all kinds of different devices, including medical equipment and turntables, and in Europe, records. And Jim goes on to share a link with what he says is, well, I've listened. Yeah, it is a politically incorrect CB-themed song, and it's called CB Savage by Rod Hart. Came out in the 70s. I don't know much about it at all, but I will share a link to that in the show notes on the website myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. Little disclaimer here, it might be kind of a little bit offensive to some people, and I apologize for that. It's, I think, more a product of its time than anything else. No current offense is intended. But also, something that I wanted to do is kind of go back on the previous episode, episode 8, featuring the album Reach by Richard Simmons. It turns out that when I was doing post-production on that episode, I stumbled on a video on YouTube of somebody doing the prescribed exercises along with the entire album. So I linked it in episode 8's show notes. It's really cool. I believe the person who runs that channel goes through all kinds of vintage workouts and actually does them all, and Reach happened to be one of them. So anywho, now that we've taken care of those goodies, let's take a look at this episode's featured records. And since they come from Sears, I figured a little bit of a history about the Sears department store is in order. Know as Sears, Roebuck & Company began in North Redwood, Minnesota, with a young railroad station agent named Richard Warren Sears. He happened upon a shipment of watches whose intended recipient refused delivery, so he bought that shipment and sold the watches for a small price, but still at a profit, to his coworkers at the railroad station. And so began the R.W. Sears Watch Company in 1886, and it was a mail-order business. Later that year, Sears met a watch repairman named Alva Curtis Roebuck. In 1887, Sears and Roebuck moved to Chicago and published the first Sears catalog, which offered watches and jewelry. Sears sold that business for $100,000 in 1889. $100,000, that is, in 1889 money, keep in mind, and he moved to rural Iowa with the intention of becoming a banker. 3 years later, he returned to Chicago and started a new mail-order company with Roebuck, in which they sold watches and jewelry, and they called it the A.C. Roebuck Watch Company. On September 16, 1893, the company was renamed Sears, Roebuck & Company, and the catalogs started to offer more than just watches and jewelry. In particular, the catalogs were kind of sort of targeted to farmers, because farmers tended to go to general stores to buy their everyday needs, but the Sears catalog offered a much bigger variety than what general stores in rural areas could offer. Over time, the catalog grew significantly, adding a bigger variety of products every year. By 1896, the catalog included dolls, sewing machines, stoves, groceries, sporting goods, phonographs, and even cars, among other things. And in fact, from 1908 to 1942, you could actually order a house from the Sears catalog. Yes, a house that you could live in. In fact, Sears sold over 70,000 of what they called Sears Modern Homes. You'd order a house, and the materials would be shipped to you, usually via a railroad boxcar, and it was up to you to get those materials built into a house, whether you did it yourself or you hired a builder to do it for you. Now, George Carlin once asked, "Whatever happened to Roebuck?" Well, I have an answer for him. I just wish he were here to hear it. Roebuck quit the company in 1895, but he did come back later to work in publicity for the catalog. In August of that year, Chicago businessman Aaron Nussbaum and his brother-in-law Julius Rosenwald bought out Roebuck's half of the company for $75,000, and again, 1895 money there. After leaving Sears, Alva Roebuck would be involved in companies that made and distributed motion picture machines and accessories, and he would later be the president of the Emerson Typewriter Company. Rosenwald, by the way, would take over the company in 1908 after Sears retired for health reasons. Meanwhile, though, Sears, Roebuck & Company had a problem. Their headquarters in 1895 on West Adams Street in Chicago was too small to handle the growing business. And so was the new headquarters they eventually moved into in the Fulton Market part of town in the next year. So in 1905, the company bought up 40 acres of land on the west side of Chicago that would become the Sears, Roebuck & Company complex, which was located at 925 South Holman Avenue. Here's a little bit of what they had in what was essentially a city within a city over the years that they were at that location. They had a mail order processing facility. They had their own bank. They had a central administration building, a merchandise development lab, a 200,000-gallon water tank, a power plant, their own police department and fire department, an administration building, a newspaper publicity office, a cafeteria that for a while was actually gender segregated, and they had athletic courts and tennis courts and their own sports teams. Some of the buildings from that complex still exist to this day, including the original Sears Tower, which is now called the John D. and Alexandra C. Nichols Tower, and you can visit that location at 906 South Homan. The first Sears retail store opened on February 2nd, 1925, right there at that complex, and the store was designed by Robert E. Wood. And here's a fun fact for you. There is a huge indoor shopping mall in Schaumburg, Illinois, northwest of the city of Chicago, and it's called Woodfield Mall. And for a long time, it was the world's largest indoor shopping mall. That name, Woodfield, combines two different names. The field part comes from Marshall Field, and the wood part comes from Robert E. Wood, the person who designed the first Sears Roebuck & Company store. There was a strategy for the original locations of the Sears stores that popped up. They were specifically located away from central shopping districts so that they could favor residential and more rural areas, and of course offer plenty of free parking so you wouldn't have to fight for a spot in the street that you might have to pay for. In 1913, they introduced the Kenmore brand with a sewing machine. You might have heard of Craftsman Tools. Well, that brand was launched in 1927, and Sears launched Allstate Insurance Company in 1931. Perhaps the most iconic thing about Sears Roebuck & Company was the Wish Book.
There's more for your life at Sears.
Did you get it, Mom?
What?
The Sears Wish Book.
Oh yeah, it's right here.
Oh, thanks.
Every kid loved looking through the Sears Wish Book around Christmas time for stuff to put on their Christmas lists. Well, guess what? That was launched in 1933. In 1967, there was the Die Hard car battery that Sears introduced. You can see that Sears brought us a lot of different brand names, and by 1969, they were the world's biggest retailer. But the problem is that huge complex on the west side of Chicago, it was too small. So the company needed to relocate 7,000 employees to a new site. That new site would be the 110-story, 1,454-foot tall Sears Tower downtown on 233 South Wacker Drive. Employees started moving into that building in September of 1973. The Sears Tower was the world's tallest building, and it held that title for a quarter of a century. Unfortunately, though, despite business peaking in the 70s, growth projections were not met, and because of that, many workers had to be laid off, and that resulted in more empty space in the Sears Tower than expected over the years. So that prompted Sears to renovate the building in 1984 in hopes of attracting more tenants to move in. In 1988, Sears offered the Sears Tower for sale, but instead they refinanced it in 1989 through MetLife and AEW Capital Management, the latter of whom took ownership of the tower in 1994. By that time, though, Sears had started to move its employees again from the Sears Tower to a new headquarters in Hoffman Estates, about 30 miles, give or take, northwest of downtown Chicago. As for the Sears Tower, though, Sears held on to the naming rights until 2003, although the Sears Tower name stayed intact until 2009, when the London-based Willis Group Holdings Limited acquired the naming rights, at which point the official name of the building became the Willis Tower. Having said that, though, let's get realistic. We still call it the Sears Tower. That's what it will always be. But getting away from provinciality and getting back to Sears, before you blame the internet for the decline of Sears and, well, other department stores, Sears' business problems became apparent in the early 80s. And that decline, well, many people blamed it on the company's constant diversifying, including launching such businesses as the Prodigy Online Services and the Discover credit card. And because of all these new endeavors Sears was branching out into, they kind of lost focus on the stores. Eventually, Kmart Holdings Corporation acquired Sears in November of 2004, and that corporation eventually filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in October 2018 and offered over 500 stores, roughly half of which were Sears stores, for sale, with the remaining stores having liquidation sales. By that time, there were no longer any Sears stores, not just in Chicago, but the entire state of Illinois. From my research, as of September 5th, 2024, there were 11 stores remaining, at least in North America. There are 4 in California, Whittier, Burbank, Concord, and Stockton, 2 in Washington, Union Gap and Tukwila, Braintree, Massachusetts, Orlando and Miami, Florida, El Paso, Texas, and Hato Rey, Puerto Rico. Sears was really such a powerhouse retailer, but oh, how the mighty have fallen. Lack of focus, dwindling customer service, an online presence that was never fully realized, those were but a few of the contributors to the company's downfall. Really, when Sears was in its heyday, it was just like Amazon.com. It started off by selling just one little item, really, and then eventually boomed into selling just about anything you could think of. Just too bad that Sears couldn't follow Amazon's model all the way to the internet, as it were. But, friends, let's flash back to a more prosperous time for Sears. They were still headquartered on Holman Avenue in Chicago, and let's visit its home economics department.
This is the way we do our clothes, wash our clothes, dry our clothes. This is the way we do our clothes with Kenmore's wonderful action.
Many people in the Western Hemisphere, my age and older, either lived in a home with a Kenmore washing machine or was related to somebody who had a Kenmore washing machine at home. And if that Kenmore washing machine was manufactured during a particular range of years, a small cardboard phonograph record was included with the owner's manual. It was called Get More from Your Kenmore.
Now that your new Kenmore is installed, of course you're thrilled with it and anxious to use it. But it's important to learn to operate it correctly to make sure you get the best of all the benefits it offers.
If you were to play the record, you would hear the crackly sounds of a cheaply made record, along with a woman singing a stylized version of Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, sneaking in a plug for Kenmore. Then you would hear her voice urging you to read the manual thoroughly and frequently so you can get the most from your washing machine or dryer, and to call Sears when you would eventually inevitably need service on the machine. Next, an anonymous male voice would essentially try to sell you an extended warranty, really.
We here in the Sears Service Department want to help you get the greatest satisfaction from your Kenmore. And the best way of all is to take advantage of our new Kenmore year-round service contract. This is only available at Sears. While your Kenmore already carries a very liberal parts and service guarantee, you now can protect yourself for many years beyond this guarantee.
And after he said his piece, you would hear from the unnamed woman again, encouraging you to write to Jean Shaw, care of the Sears Home Economics Department, if you ever encounter a problem with your washer or dryer. But who is this Jean Shaw person? Some believe that Jean Shaw is the woman's voice we hear on the record, even though that voice is never actually directly identified. Her name appears on the record as Director, Home Economics Laboratories, along with what I assume is an artist's rendering of her, but it's not an actual photograph. Is it actually Jean Shaw on the record, though? Well, I don't know, and sadly, no research I was able to do definitively concludes one way or the other. On one hand, if it were Jean Shaw on the record, she would certainly have said it right to me, Jean Shaw, in her narration at the end, but on the other hand, she does say here at the Home Economics Department at Sears, which implies to me that the voice belongs to a Sears employee, if not Jean Shaw specifically. Thing is, though, both the woman and the man sound like professional voiceover artists, so I'm guessing they were outsourced for the recording. Depending on which Sears operating manual you look at and which newspaper articles you read, Jean Shaw is either the director of the Cold Spot Home Service Department, Cold Spot being yet another Sears brand, or, more likely, the director of home economics. She also authored several books, including but not limited to Jean Shaw's Pastry Cloth Recipes, Quick, Easily Prepared Recipes for Your Kenmore Electric Servants, Easy Sure Electric Cooking with Your Kenmore, and How to Care for Your Freezer. Now, in doing my research for this episode, I found a theory that maybe there was no such person as Jean Shaw, but instead she may have been a character designed by someone in publicity at Sears to be the face and voice of the Home Economics Department, kind of like, say, there was no such person as Betty Crocker. I did find an article in the August 24th, 1951 edition of the Chicago Daily Tribune, which identified Miss Agnes Fisher as the woman behind Jean Shaw. So that might lend a little bit of credence to the theory that maybe there was not really a person named Jean Shaw. It just happened to be whoever they decided at one point to represent the company on behalf of the Home Economics Department. So in addition to the mystery as to who exactly Gene Shaw really is or is not, there's another mystery to the record. When was the record recorded and distributed? Discogs.com has 1965 as the release date, but I seriously doubt that. Or at the very least, I'm pretty sure the record was first released many years before 1965. The look and the sound of the record are just too old-fashioned for that time. The fact that Gene Shaw's name is on it would probably make you think you could narrow down when the recording was made, but nope. Gene Shaw's name appears in Sears-related products and articles going back to the 40s and up through the 60s. The only real way we'd be able to know when the record originated is to find out what models of Kenmore washers and dryers the record was distributed with and when those models were available. Spoiler alert, I sadly was unable to do that. However, I am pretty sure the recording was made sometime after 1957. Why that particular time? Well, because most records have something written on the playing surface of the record at the very end, right by the label. You might see something etched, something stamped, or a little bit of each. In the case of Get More from Your Kenmore, the logo for Sheldon Recording Studios is stamped in the runout groove. The Sheldon that said studios were named after was the studio owner, Jack Sheldon Weiner. Pause for my listeners to giggle for a moment. Okay. He first opened his studio on the second floor of 2120 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago's South Loop. If that address sounds familiar, you know your stuff, because the ground level of that building was Chess Records, many of whose recordings were engineered by Jack Weiner. The studios moved to 1725 North Wells Street in Chicago's Old Town neighborhood, and then eventually to a garage of a house at 6742 North Trumbull. The Sheldon record labels that have that address list them as Chicago, but it's actually Lincolnwood. I don't know if the city was rezoned or a street was renamed or something, but yeah, it's Lincolnwood. Whatever the case, the studio moved eventually to 211 East Grand Avenue, which is now a Ronald McDonald House. The studio operated through the 60s, although the Sheldon Recording Studio's name was still being dropped into the early 70s. Now, the record itself, it measures roughly 5 inches by 5 inches square with a red background. In the middle of the square, you have a drawing of a circular record, and that circular record's label has a picture of a woman who, again, may or may not be Gene Shaw. Above that drawn record is the title, Get More from Your Kenmore, and below that on the faux record label to the left of the drawing, apparently of Gene Shaw, you have the sentence, This record tells you how. Underneath that, there's a signature of Gene Shaw with the phrase, Director, Home Economics Laboratory right below it. At the bottom of the record is written, P.S. Also, here facts you should know about an important new Kenmore service. That would be the service plan extended warranty, whatever you want to call it. On the lower left, it tells you to play the record at 33 1/3 RPM. And on the lower right, there's a drawing of a Sears repairman in a rather spiffy uniform. And next to that picture is what I'm assuming is some sort of part number. It says number, well, abbreviated NO period 93304. At the very bottom of the record is this note. If record slips on phonograph, remove the paper strips on back and press firmly to turntable. I have 3 copies of that record and none of them have the strips, which tells me the previous owners removed them for whatever reason. But for whatever it's worth, the record played back for me with no slippage whatsoever. Where did I find my 3 copies of the record? Well, it was an eBay listing from a vendor that I had recently made a purchase from, and I was so happy with that previous purchase and the follow-up and the friendliness of the vendor that I decided, hey, I'm going to check out some more of the stuff she has up. And when I found this, there was no way I wasn't going to order it. And by the way, let this be a lesson, folks. If you're trying to sell something and you treat your buyer right, that buyer will come back for more. Unfortunately, I don't remember who the vendor was, but I asked her if she knew anything about the record, but all she could tell me was that the records came packed with Kenmore owner's manuals. But you know what? As much as I tried and as much as I want to, I just could not find out a lot of information as to exactly when the record first happened, who Gene Shaw definitively is, or who the male narrator is on the record. So having said that, let me see if I can make more sense out of the other Sears record I want to talk about today. Young Ladies in Review from the Sears School for Young Charmers. The first thing I want to talk about with Young Ladies in Review is how I found the record. I made a stop at Rediscover Records in Elgin, Illinois, pretty close to Hoffman Estates, by the way. In the back of the store, in a box of 7-inch records, there was a plain white paper sleeve with Sears School for Young Charmers and Young Ladies in Review written on it. The price tag, $1.89. The record itself didn't have much on it to tell me exactly what it was. The blue label just said, Sears School for Young Charmers on the top in a serif font face, all capitalized. The bottom in a bold title case sans serif font face read, Young Ladies in Review. In the center of the label on the left side, there is a catalog number, which is BRS 2111. And then on the right side, it says 33.3 RPM. All of this is in black text, by the way, and the record has a small spindle hole, the same size spindle hole as on a 12-inch record. On the other side of the record, again, a blue label with black text, but on top in a big, thin, all capitalized sans serif font, there's a note that says, do not play this side. Below the spindle hole in a smaller font, I'm told, this is a silent groove to improve the molding of your pressing. Weird. Especially because looking at the playing surface of side 1, there are actually 2 bands. So why not just put one of the banded tracks on side 1 and the other banded track on side 2? I don't know. I'm a software engineer. I'm not a record presser. But whatever the case, what exactly was this Sears School for Young Charmers? Did the Sears department store people actually run it, or did it just happen to be named Sears after somebody else and not related at all? Time for some research. First of all, yes, the charm school was indeed run by Sears, Roebuck, and Company. In fact, many department stores had charm schools, including the Wendy Ward Charm School at Montgomery Ward and the Pretty Girl Charm School at Wiebelt's. Other department stores had charm schools, and that includes, but is not limited to, Carson Peary Scott and Company, Gilmore's, Dillard's, and Gimbel's. From what I understand, the roughly $25 tuition at department store charm schools was much less expensive than at standalone charm schools, so that parents who couldn't afford to send their kids to a full-fledged charm school, they still had kind of a bargain option that they could use. But the first Sears School for Young Charmers, later known, by the way, as the Sears Discovery Charm School, the first one opened at the Sears store at 3610 Peck Road in El Monte, California in 1963. Shortly after that El Monte store opened a charm school, 16 other stores in the LA area followed suit. As of 1966, 256 Sears stores in the United States offered courses at the School for Young Charmers and boasted over 100,000 graduates. In its heyday, courses at the Sears School for Young Charmers were open to girls between the ages of 9 and 19 inclusive, and met for about an hour once a week for 8 to 10 weeks, depending on location, in classes divided by age group. And by the way, they eventually allowed boys in the classes too. Class size was between 15 and 20 students, from what I gather. Topics covered in these courses include, but are not limited to, exercise, diet, voice and speech, modeling, skincare and grooming, makeup, fashion, and of course manners. The textbook for the course was a pretty fancy 3-ring binder with illustrations and various inserts here and there. I heard from one graduate of the Sears Charm School that at one class session, students would empty the contents of their purses into a big pile so that those contents could be judged on their appropriateness. There were posture lessons, and of course they involved the fabled walking while balancing a book on your head trope and sitting with your knees closed together with your ankles crossed. The girls in these classes were also taught how to talk to boys, how to style their hair to match their head and face types, and how to graciously accept dance requests, among other things. At the end of the course, there was a fashion show that the students would put on, and they would show off clothing that they chose from what was available at that Sears location. From what I've found, many alums of the Sears School for Young Charmers and the Sears Discovery Charm School, they look back on their times with varied thoughts, many of which have fond memories, including those who were forced unwillingly to go from their parents. A few have PTSD, especially if they considered themselves tomboys. Sears discontinued the charm schools in around 1986. I didn't realize they went that long. I certainly don't remember ever hearing about this charm school until I got the record. But at some point during the life of the Sears School for Young Charmers, a 7-inch record was produced. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. To be honest, I just kind of let the record sit for a couple of years before I actually listened to it. And during those couple of years, I just assumed it was some kind of a introductory record given to students or prospective students who were considering or about to join the Sears School for Young Charmers, maybe talking about what to expect from the course and that kind of thing. But you know what it's often said about what happens if you assume. So when I finally played the record, I heard the song that you all heard at the beginning of this episode, clocking in at about 2 minutes 50 seconds. The second track banded on the record is a slightly shorter version of the song that's instrumental. Well, almost instrumental. There's a short passage with wordless vocals. Oh, and not only is this the first 7-inch record I featured on an episode of this podcast, but I believe it's also the first locked groove record I've discussed. In case you don't know what I mean by locked groove, well, remember I said that side 1 of this record has 2 tracks. First the song, and then the instrumental version of the song. The thing is, though, when you play the record, you put the stylus on the first track like most people would do, you let it play through, it's not actually going to advance automatically to the next track. The stylus is just going to hang there in between the 2 tracks, and you have to actually manually lift the tone arm and put the stylus on the next track yourself. And from my personal experience, sometimes you don't get it placed right and it still lands in that locked groove at the end of the previous track. Now, because the next track does not play automatically, here's what I think the purpose of the record is. The lyrics of Young Ladies in Review, as sung by a group of women, well, they clearly state that they're graduates. So my thought is that at least in some locations, the song was played during the graduation ceremony, or maybe the fashion show. The song consists of 1 verse sung in unison, and then there's nearly a minute-long instrumental passage after which the song modulates a half step up, and then that verse is repeated. And I'm not going to lie, friends, that spoken part in the beginning kind of weirded me out, as if they were all brainwashed to say something, like a bunch of zombified women saying, "We will comply." So anyway, that's enough of my editorializing right now. As for the instrumental passage in the middle of the song, my theory is that the MC of the graduation ceremony would speak over that part of the song, possibly reading from a script. And the thing about this record having a locked groove, let's say this record is indeed played during the ceremony, and the person operating the record player absentmindedly forgot to stop the record after the song played out. That way, with the locked groove, you won't suddenly hear the next track unexpectedly. So now the operator of the record player just has to re-cue on to the next track and then hit start at the appropriate time to play the next track. Why is there an instrumental version of the song? My guess is that it was background music played during the fashion show, with perhaps the instructor introducing each student as she modeled the clothes she picked out from the racks at Sears. I'm using words like guess and maybe theory here and there, and there's a reason. I cannot for the life of me find out the story about this record. I had a couple of alums listen to it, but they said they never heard it before, including one who went to the school in its early days, like 1963, 1964. She said the song sounded too old-fashioned for that time, that it sounds like it was recorded more for her parents' time, and I cannot disagree with that in the least. Listen to Young Ladies in Review, and you'd never ever think 60s, especially 63. It could be that those in charge were just stuck in the 50s. Indeed, judging from one account of the school that I read in a blog, in the late 60s and early 70s, The words in the materials in the textbook of the binder, that changed with the times, but the illustrations did not. Having said that, though, if anybody listening has any information about this record, please reach out to me. Listen to the end of the episode for the various ways you can contact me. There were a couple of things that gave me hints, though. Again, I speak of the run-out groove. There are two things in particular that are etched in the run-out groove that can tell me at least a tiny piece of the story. The matrix number that I mentioned before, BRS2111, might give me a hint. That was etched in the run-out groove in addition to being written on the label. The BRS initials might be telling me that the recording was done at Broadway Recording Studios at 1697 Broadway in New York City, which is in the same building as the Ed Sullivan Theater, where The Late Show with Stephen Colbert currently takes place. At the very least, it may be an indication that the lacquer from which this record was born was made by Broadway Recording Studios. But if it is indeed from said studios, that means that it couldn't possibly have been made any earlier than 1960, when the studio opened as a subsidiary of Transnational Communications. For whatever it's worth, Broadway Recording Studios shut down in 1981, just in case you were wondering. The other etching in the run-out groove that tells me a tiny bit of the story is a hand-etched capital I, which is a giveaway that the record itself was pressed by RCA Records pressing plant at 7900 Rockville Road in Indianapolis, which, by the way, that address is now home to a value-added resources warehouse. Given that the record was pressed in Indianapolis, I'm led to believe that it was used by a Sears Charm School location somewhere in the Midwest. If copies were made for, say, locations on the East Coast, they likely were pressed by RCA's pressing plant in Rockaway, New Jersey, and would have the letter R hand-etched in the run-out groove. Unfortunately, though, I've yet to encounter another copy of this record, either in person or online. If any of you happen to have one, let me know if the run-out groove on yours says anything different. You might need a magnifying glass to help you. But whatever the case, I'm actually very confident that RCA in Indianapolis did press this record, because doing some searching on Discogs.com revealed that there were other 7-inch records pressed by RCA in Indianapolis that have a blank side 2 with the side 2 label having the exact same verbiage about how it's a blank groove. Most of what I found were promo records not meant for commercial distribution. Unfortunately, my friends, that's all I can tell you about the record. But if I do find out any more about it, I will certainly bring it up in this podcast at a later time. But for now, let me share a few record collecting thoughts. We've all heard it repeated among our friends, family, and human interest stories in the news. Vinyl records have outsold compact discs for the first time since 1990 whenever. Records are making a comeback. The number of people who own vinyl records is twice the number of people who actually own a turntable. I can tell you the flawed logic of each of those oft-repeated statements, but that's not what I want to talk to you about right now. What I'd rather do is talk about one of the reasons that might contribute to one of these faulty statements. Why are records such a hot commodity these days? One reason, well, many fans of records feel that records are better than streaming, downloads, MP3s, CDs, tapes, or whatever other sound medium you can think of. The thing is, some who hear others say that the sound quality of records is the best might be in for a rude awakening when they dip their toes into the vinyl water. Records don't necessarily automatically sound better than any other sound format. But what could at least make a record sound the best it possibly can? So let's talk about the various ways that the listening experience can be affected in terms of how a record sounds. Well, there are so many factors involved. But first, let me talk to you about one thing that has no effect on sound quality. Anybody listening who's already an intense record collector knows what I'm about to say. The weight of the record. A standard 12-inch vinyl record typically weighs between 120 and 150 grams. So-called audiophile pressings are often delivered in the form of vinyl that weighs 180 up to 220 grams. You may have seen that before, now on 180-gram vinyl. Is that 180-gram thing just a marketing gimmick? Possibly. I will admit they do feel really nice to hold, they feel sturdy, and they're theoretically less prone to warps. Whether they actually are, well, that's up for debate. But one thing you have to look out for, though, is that those heavier records will wear out the cover much sooner than standard weight records, but that's not really an issue for me because I keep my records outside of the covers, keeping a record and its cover inside a single outer sleeve. Conversely, you have those RCA Dynaflex records that were out from about 1969 through sometime in the 70s. Dynaflex records were made out of a special type of vinyl that was more malleable than usual, and even better for the bean counters at RCA Records, cheaper, and they were very thin and light, as low as 95 grams. I have a few of those Dynaflex records in my collection, and I gotta tell you, they do sound fantastic. So weight or thinness or thickness of the vinyl doesn't really matter. You know what else doesn't matter? The color of the vinyl. Color is just that. It's just the dye used in the vinyl pellets that eventually become that record. Black, red, white, orange, green, blue, multicolored, doesn't matter. While color doesn't affect the sound, though, you might want to be wary of picture discs. They look cool, but they do have a couple of disadvantages. For one thing, it's usually pretty hard to see the rills on a picture disc. In case you don't know what a rill is, rills are those gaps between songs. So if you're playing a picture disc and you want to skip straight to a specific song, you're going to have a little bit of a challenge finding where that song starts. But the true disadvantage of picture discs, most of them don't sound that great. You'll hear a lot of surface noise. That surface noise is just the nature of the beast. From what I understand, picture discs have a thin plastic coating on top of the vinyl to protect the picture, and that coating produces a lot of noise. I will say, though, that if the music on a picture disc is loud enough, the surface noise might not really matter all that much. But really, picture discs are a novelty that are better looked at than listened to. Having said that, though, the technology behind picture discs is improving day by day. What does matter about the vinyl that the record is pressed on is the quality of the vinyl. Virgin vinyl is going to sound much cleaner, much less noisy than recycled vinyl. How can you tell, though, if a record you want to buy is pressed on virgin vinyl? Well, there's no real way to know unless it says somewhere on the album itself, be it in the liner notes or a hype sticker. You really can't tell if it's virgin vinyl. Another factor that goes in the sound of a recording, and this is really important, the mastering of the record. The producer is going to guide the artist who's making the recording into making the best possible recording and will supervise the mixing. After the mixing is done, the mixes go for banding and mastering. The mastering engineer is going to apply some final tweaks to make sure the recording sounds the best it can for whatever playback device that it's intended for. Digital and analog, that's another thing to consider with vinyl sound quality. Was the vinyl pressed from an analog master or a digital master? Records are an analog medium, so naturally the tendency for many vinyl fans is to favor analog mastered records. Indeed, if I myself see two copies of a record in a used record store and I know that one is from a digital master but the other is from an analog master, I'm going to go for the analog one. An article I recently read talked about how most records produced from new recordings made since the 80s are going to be digital because, well, the advent of digital recording technology. What matters, though, is how well the mastering is done, analog or digital. Your favorite internet search engine is your friend. Use it to look at listener reviews of different pressings of different records. A vinyl record might come from a digital source, but that doesn't mean it's not going to sound great. Another thing you want to be aware of with mastering, you might buy what is considered an audiophile record specifically mastered for the most discriminating ears. Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab is one of the most prominent makers of these audiophile records, although they have been getting a lot of flack lately because in the last year or so, it's been found out that their mastering process has at least one digital step. Many audiophile records are mastered at half speed, meaning that the cutting lathe is slowed down to 16 2/3 RPM so that when the resulting records are played back at 33 1/3, the sound quality will be more detailed. And by the way, that's another thing to keep in mind, folks. If there's a reissue of an album coming out and it's on 2 records that play back at 45 RPM, well, the reason for that is that the faster playback speed will result in a higher quality playback. So that's something to consider too, the speed of the playback. The downside of having a single 33 1/3 RPM record album split up into 2 45 RPM records is, of course, you have to flip the record over more. But going back to the audiophile records, one thing you have to keep in mind is that audiophile records are mastered for audiophile equipment. If you have one of those plain old 2-speed turntables that cost maybe $120 or even less, and you use the stylus that comes prepackaged with the unit, you probably won't be able to take advantage of all that the audiophile mastered records have to offer. In a previous episode, I talked about how I have a couple of half-speed reissues by The Who that just didn't really sound all that great on my equipment, but when I upgraded my stylus to an Ortofon Blue, which I can't really say for sure is necessarily an audiophile stylus, but certainly at least one step above the stylus that my Audio-Technica LP1240 shipped with. Once I got that Ortofon Blue stylus, the sound on those records by The Who was measurably brighter, and it confirmed that what I thought was an expensive upgrade was actually well worth it. Something you might have never thought of because, well, you might not realize it, what the record is made of might also affect the sound quality. If you have a lot of those 7-inch singles and EPs in your collection, or 45s as some people say, chances are some of them might not actually be made of vinyl, especially if they're made in the 70s or 80s. It was very common for some singles to be pressed on styrene. To most ears, records pressed on vinyl sound generally better, and they're less fragile than styrene records. Indeed, over the years, I've had a few singles that actually cracked. And one thing they have in common, they're all made of styrene. How do you know whether a 7-inch record in your collection is vinyl or styrene? Well, styrene kind of feels like plastic. Also, the labels are glued onto styrene records, whereas the labels on vinyl records are more or less embedded into the vinyl itself. You may also happen across flexi discs in your travels. Those are specialty records that aren't really your typical mainstream discs, and you'd often put a coin on the record to keep it from slipping. You remember that McDonald's contest from the 80s that had a record you had to listen to? Well, that record was a flexi disc. Don't expect those things to be of audiophile quality, nor should you expect great audio quality from the records that were pressed on cardboard, such as the ones that would be pressed on cereal boxes in the 60s and 70s, and of course, the Get More From Your Kenmore record featured in this episode. Those sound really bad and crackly. Even worse, you may have heard about how Western popular music would be secretly distributed on old X-rays behind the Iron Curtain. I have one of those so-called bone records, and take my word for it, not only is the sound quality very, very bad, but it's also very difficult to play without the stylus slipping. Another thing that's going to affect the sound, cleanliness. If there's a lot of dirt and other particles in the record, the sound is not going to be the best it can be. You're going to hear a lot of crackling, a lot of popping. Before you play a record for the first time, I urge, nay, I beg you to clean it. Back in episode 1, I spoke to great extent about ways to clean records. Whether you bought a record from a dusty thrift shop or brand new sealed straight from the record company, clean the playing surface of the vinyl before you play it for the first time. At the very least, use a record brush with a cleaning solution, or get yourself a spin clean record washer, which is what I use religiously. If you're willing to spend more money than I am, well, look into one of those vacuum-based record cleaners, or under the most ideal circumstances, invest a few grand in a sonic record cleaner. If you can afford to have one of those in your home, please contact me with the name of the company you worked for and if they're currently hiring. But whatever the case, please clean your records before you play them for the first time. And if they need to be cleaned again later, which they inevitably will after a while, please do so. Not only will the sound be better than if you didn't, but clean records also reduce wear and tear on your stylus. Static is also going to affect the sound quality. If there's a lot of static buildup in your record, it's going to play back with a lot of crackles and pops. There are ways to reduce static buildup on the record, such as using anti-static inner sleeves. And if you want to invest $80 to $100 in an anti-static gun, those things work pretty well too. There's just a very special process you have to do. You can't just take it out of the box and go click, 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 click. You have to do a special process that I'm not going to get into right now. But what else determines how good a record is going to sound? The playback equipment. So if you're just dipping your toes into the record listening world and you play a record and you listen to it and you're like, I don't know why people go crazy for this. This doesn't sound very good at all. It might be your equipment. Remember that mid-60s Mickey Mouse record player that I talked about a few episodes back with the crackly single speaker? Well, what do you think a record will sound better on? That or something along the lines of the Audio-Technica LP120 series? And if you have that Audio-Technica unit or something better, what do you think will give you better sound? The cartridge and stylus that it ships with, assuming that it does ship with one in the first place, or an upgraded stylus and cartridge that might involve a 3-digit investment? And I'm not just talking about the equipment that actually touches your record, but also any equipment attached to the turntable. The preamplifier you use with your turntable, whether it might be one built into the unit or a standalone preamp. Different preamps will give you different aural experiences. Do you route your player through a stereo receiver? Of course, the receiver might make a difference in how your record sounds and how you set up the EQ. The speakers, let's not forget about the speakers. Different speakers will have different playback sound. What else can I say about that? So yes, my friends, what does affect the sound quality of your record listening experience? The mastering of the record, the pressing of the record, the substance the record is made of, the turntable you use to play the record, and the stylus and cartridge attached to the tone arm on that turntable, the stereo receiver, the speakers, cleanliness, static buildup or lack thereof. All that and many other factors will affect how good your records sound. But I'll let you in on a little secret on how to determine whether your records sound the best they can and that you have the best listening experience. There's a device that most of us have 2 functioning instances of. They're called ears. Use them. They are your most reliable way of determining how good your records sound. And just like with all the different playback equipment out there are many, many variations of ears. Everybody hears differently with their ears. Again, ears are the most reliable way of determining how good your records sound. If you have one of those suitcase-style record players with the built-in speakers and your record listening experience on that suitcase-style record player is to your satisfaction and you enjoy it, then congratulations, you're doing it right. All that matters is how it sounds to you. Try not to let those gatekeepers detract from your enjoyment. For those of you who are veteran listeners to this podcast, this is not new information, but of course, for those of you who are new, this is new. Each record I talk about on this podcast, I rank on a scale of 1 through 5 inclusive on 5 factors, meaning that each record will have a score of between 5 and 25 inclusive. The first factor I rate on will be either local interest or usefulness based on what is actually on the record. Second, I take into account historical interest. Is the record an interesting sign of its time? The other factors I rate records on are their uniqueness, weirdness, and enjoyability. We're going to start with Get More from Your Kenmore. I don't think I'll rate based on local interest. I mean, really, even though the company is very, very Chicago-based, the record actually got much wider distribution all over the nation, if not outside of the United States as well. So let's just consider its usefulness. Honestly, friends, I don't look at Get More from Your Kenmore as anything more than just a novelty, just a little fun thing you could put on your record player. There's really nothing useful to hear on the record that you wouldn't have been able to find out from your product's owner's manual. So for usefulness, I'd have to rate the record a 1, which, by the way, technically makes Get More from Your Kenmore the most useless record I've talked about in this podcast. For historical interest, well, I kind of have to give the record a 5, and I'll tell you why. This little cardboard record is certainly a sign of the times. The record was recorded at a studio that existed in the 50s and 60s, and it was distributed for a major department store chain that, let's get real, even though it has a few locations, it's a thing of the past. And when the record was a current thing, Sears had a home economics department, and the store was headquartered on a massive campus that predates its famous headquarters on Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago. The record comes from a time when the Kenmore name had a solid reputation. But is the record unique? Well, I'm not going to beat around the bush. No, it is not. Get More from Your Kenmore is not hard to find. And really, it's not hard to understand why. Kenmore sold how many appliances that came with owner's manuals that had this record? As I was typing up my notes for this episode, I did a quick search on both eBay and Etsy for Get More from Your Kenmore. My search yielded 16 copies on eBay and 2 on Etsy, with by far the most expensive one costing $25, and that includes shipping. When I checked Discogs.com, there were 50 copies reported in possession of registered users and 10 for sale on Discogs.com. And I myself have 3 copies of the thing. The only reason I'm rating this record a 2 instead of a 1 for uniqueness is that it is a novelty, a record pressed on a 5-inch piece of cardboard. But the thing about a 5-inch cardboard record is, well, it's kind of weird when you consider that even in the time the record was made, records were usually pressed on 7 or 12-inch vinyl discs, possibly even 10-inch shellac discs. And a typical record you'd put on your turntable doesn't have a happy little jingle about a washing machine and 2 different narrators. And if you're anything like me in that most of your records are standard popular music records or other mainstream genres, you'll find this thing pretty weird. So you know what? Get More from Your Kenmore gets a 5 for weirdness from me. How about enjoyability? Well, let me ask you this, my friends. How much do you enjoy listening to an anonymous woman singing a variation of Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush and being encouraged to read the manual before setting up your washing machine? If I'm being realistic, I can't imagine the record would have gotten a ton of spins on the Zenith consoles back in the day, and I'm pretty sure that people who own this record now keep it as a novelty. I certainly don't play it a lot. I played it once when it arrived, and again when I recorded it for digitization and preservation purposes to prepare for this podcast. I'm not going to give the record a low enjoyability rating, though, because it's not the worst thing I've ever heard by far, so I'll just be kind of wishy-washy and give it a 3 out of 5 for enjoyability. Recapping my ratings, that's 1 for usefulness, 5 for historical interest, 2 for uniqueness, 5 for weirdness, and 3 for enjoyability, which gives Get More from Your Kenmore a composite rating of 16 out of 25, tying with custom music for 8mm featured in episode 6. To break that tie, I have to go by what I'd more likely listen to if I had a choice. Given my appreciation for dated and tacky music, I'd probably be more likely to listen to custom music for 8mm. So, Get More from Your Kenmore ranks just a notch lower and 1 spot above Auto Harp for Students and Educators, which I talked about in episode 3. Now, let's talk about my rating for Young Ladies in Review. Given that the Sears School for Young Charmers existed at many stores across the U.S., I'm not going to consider local interests, so I'll have to talk about its usefulness. And given my own observations about the record and what I have concluded its purpose is, I'd have to say the record would only be useful for those who worked at one of those charm schools, and that it wasn't necessarily widely used, and even if it was used for a very short time. So this sucker didn't get much use, so I'd have to rate Young Ladies in Review a 2 for usefulness. For historical interest, I was initially thinking 4, but then I had to consider, again, this record comes from a time when, well, charm schools were a common thing, and what better thing than a charm school to tell girls they're not good enough? For Sears, their charm schools existed for about 20 years, a relatively short time in the lifespan of Sears itself. The song on the record is quite dated as well. And just that it's from Sears, man, I'm going to have to give this a 5. And oh boy, uniqueness. You have probably concluded that this record is pretty dang unique. And as I did on a previous episode, I have to apologize to grammar sticklers who correctly say that uniqueness does not have a degree. It's either unique or it's not. So I'm sorry, folks. I assure you, I too am a grammar stickler, but I gotta be a little liberal with it now. So far, this is the only record in my collection, weird or not, of which I could only find evidence of this one and only copy existing. Even that record of the grand opening ceremony of a J.J. Newberry store that I featured in episode 2, as obscure as that one is, I saw that another Discogs.com user claimed to have one. But young ladies in review, forget it. No Googling, no looking up on the resources available from the Chicago Public Library, no reaching out to historians, no former students of the Sears Charm School, no nothing turned up anything about this record. My dear listeners, there is no doubt about it. This record gets a 5 out of 5 for uniqueness. Now, as for weirdness, I had to give the record some thought. On one hand, I don't think the actual content of the record is all that weird. A sign of the times, sure. For its own purposes, there's nothing weird about it. But that there's no studio, no record company, no publisher, no anything listed on the label, and that both versions of the song are crammed on one side instead of having one on one side and the other version on the other side with the B side just blank space, that's kind of weird. Still, though, not the weirdest thing I ever encountered, so I'm going to give Young Ladies in Review a weirdness rating of 3. Moving on to enjoyability, well, all I have to say is, meh. I don't see this record getting many plays for fun, but as with the other Sears record, this also is not the most hideous thing in the world. So again, I'm going to be wishy-washy with it and rate it 3 out of 5 for enjoyability. So totaling up the ratings for Young Ladies in Review, 2 for usefulness, 5 for historical interest, 5 for uniqueness, 3 for weirdness, 3 for enjoyability. That's a composite of 18. Placing Young Ladies in Review in a tie with a self-titled album by the Singing Johnson family. And which of these 2 records am I most likely to put on my turntable? Well, I'm a sucker for vocal harmony, so Young Ladies in Review falls 1 notch below the Singing Johnson family, but 1 above Reach by Richard Simmons. And my friends, I told you everything I could about these records from Sears. Get more from your Kenmore and Young Ladies in Review. Do you have any thoughts on these records or anything else relevant to this podcast? Well, before I tell you about next month's episode, I'm going to tell you where you can send your thoughts, and I will give credit where credit is due. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F-A-B, the number 4, I-T. Or you can reach out to me on the various social networks where my handle is My Weird Records. You can also find this podcast on Facebook. Simply do a search for My Weird Record Collection, or you can go directly to facebook.com/myweirdrecords in your web browser. This podcast can also be accessed on YouTube, where you'll find not only episodes of this podcast, but also, whenever possible, audio of the records I discuss, and occasional bonus videos concerning both my weird and not so weird record collections. Just search for My Weird Record Collection, or go directly to youtube.com/@MyWeirdRecordCollection. Besides the social media, you can go to the official website for My Weird Record Collection at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. By the way, folks, sounds and music used in this podcast are the property of their respective copyright holders and are used for commentary and review. Infringement is not intended. Special thanks goes to Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, for letting me use his record, The Pac-Man EP, as the basis for the logo of this podcast. Tim and his unique and must-hear style of music can be found on his website at worm-quartet.web.app. Special thanks also goes out to Kevin Zerb. Thank you, buddy, for designing the logo artwork for this podcast. Kevin and his music and his podcasts are available on the web at zerbinator.com. Big thank you also to Donna Carroll for sharing with me her experiences with the Sears School for Young Charmers. For the next episode, my friends, we're going to take a dive into astrology. But until then, this is Sean reminding you, support your local record store.
Call your Sears serviceman or salesman to get all the facts on this wonderful plan. We want you to be happy with your Kenmore and satisfied with its performance. If you ever have a washing or drying problem, please write. Jean Shaw here at the Home Economics Department at Sears. You'll find the address on page 1 of your owner's manual.